Hello and welcome to my workshop. So today we're going to be continuing on with this 1971 Jeepster Commando. We have a pretty good bit of the body work done. We're going to get that all finished up and get to the paint. Alright, so let's get started. I'm picking back up with the Jeep by working on the door panels. A picture was imported into Fusion 360 and the panel was sketched over the picture. The pieces were angled back to back, so all the supports will end up on the back, not to be seen later on. Next up was the dash. It looked complicated at first, but it is pretty basic. This clip is from Fusion 360, where they show each step as sort of a movie. It's neat to see, but really comes in handy when you're trying to figure out where in the timeline a certain part was created. I'm getting better with sculpting in Fusion 360. This sculpting tool starts with a basic shape and is pulled, twisted, and manipulated into the final part. This would work well for a part like the dash pad, but for now, I'm still making them from wooden shape and vacuum forming them. Since the shape is very thin and fragile, I apply thin CA glue to the wood at several steps along the way. The CA glue soaks into the wood almost like a sponge. This is especially the case at cut or sanded edges. The raw surface seems to have a barrier on it, it just won't soak in. Once the part is vacuum formed and cleaned up, it can be offered up to the 3D printed dash. The next part to get cleaned up is the center console. This is one of the coolest parts in the build, in my opinion. The center console looks great, but since I hollowed it out, the opening lines up with the transmission and gives a place for the driveline to live as well. For the seats, I'm going back to vacuum forming process. I've tried making seats in Fusion 360, but it requires a lot of time and effort to get them to look correct. I find that I can get a better result by just carving by hand. The front seats are individual, and the rear is a bench seat. I thought about just making one front seat, but it makes more sense to have two, so I'm not wasting so much styrene during the vacuum forming process. After the basic shape is cut into MDF on the bandsaw, a rotary and multi-max tool is used to refine the shape. When I am making duplicates, like the front seats, I try to transfer the measurements to the other piece as I move along. I also think about the surfaces that are used to measure. If I'm going to remove something that will make it harder to transfer the design, I will stop and bring the other part to the same place I am with the first part. There are seams running front to back, and these are cut into and tapered down to represent where the material would be pulled down by the stitch. The pleats from side to side are marked out and shallow grooves cut with a Tamiya scribe tool. The seat backs are hollow and need to be covered. This is accomplished with some flat styrene. The first thing to do is make sure the backs are sanded dead flat. I either place a sheet of sandpaper on my bench or use an automotive style sanding block. The key is just to have a flat surface supporting the sandpaper so it can transfer over. The backing material is cut a little large, and once glued into place, trimmed back to the shape of the seat. To speed up the process, I added in CA glue to fill small gaps along the seam. Once sanded back, the part will look as if it's always been one piece. This is the truck variant, so the back seat is not required here. I went ahead and made the back seat because I'm also building a four-seater. To build out the bed, small strips of styrene were glued into place after measuring out where they should go. The truck variant has a separator from the cab and the bed. This also acts as a support for the cab cap, which will be made later on. I just take a flat sheet of styrene and cold bend it with a handbrake tool. It takes a little back and forth, but eventually the shape is matched up to the body. A piece is glued in place at the top. This is parallel to the floor and is what becomes a shelf to hold up the cab cap. Speaking of the cab cap, this is started with a few pieces of MDF. Eventually this will look correct, but at first glance it kind of reminds me of the Flintstone mobile. To make this part work on a vacuum form table, it will need to be two pieces. It is just too much draw and will make the styrene come out as thin as paper. The first shaping is on the benchtop belt sander. This gives the overall shape and starts to define the piece. The next step is to use a small cutting wheel on the rotary tool. This defines the front of the cab. Having this well defined gives a target to shape to when working on the roof. With the 60 grit belt on, it doesn't take long to round the roof from side to side and add some transitions for the sharper edges. The rear has a window that runs pretty low, so careful measurements were required to make sure it was in the right spot. I again used a small saw on the rotary tool to carve in a channel. I planned on adding styrene to the majority of the roof, but before I did this, I wanted to make sure it was flattened out by sanding back some glaze filler that I applied earlier. The styrene was used to make grooves that run across the roof. I believe when the grooves run across the roof versus down the roof is referred to as a French bread style. I could have cut these in with a carving tool, but the roof is a little flatter than I liked. So I started with an 80 thousandths thick styrene in the rear and transitioned to a 30 thousandths in the front. This gives the roof a slight rise as it moves toward the rear. After all the details are added to the cab cap, the top is removed from the back wall and both prepped for vacuum forming. The pieces are cut from the vacuum molds and the edges are sanded back. The most critical thing to know about solvent gluing is surface area. The more surface area you have, the better the connection. This is even more critical since we are using butt joints. These need to be sanded on both, so when held together lightly, there is no light gaps present. I do add a thin strip as a backer, but prefer to have the butt joint as good as possible first. So I decided the best way to attach this cab cap was with magnets. This would hold it down securely, allow for access to paint and detail the interior, and make it so you can actually see the detail once finished. Holes were drilled into a piece glued to the bottom of the cab cap and the shelf that was added earlier. Care needs to be taken to make sure the polarity of the magnets is correct, otherwise you'll have a mess. Drilling out a magnet is difficult, if not nearly impossible task, especially when it's glued solid in styrene. The front magnets couldn't be as large as the ones in the rear, but they're good enough to hold it in place and not come loose while driving. Holding the truck upside down will not dislodge the cab cap, but a hard shake will. This should work out fine though. I struggled with finding any reference material showing a roll bar in the rear of one of these Jeeps. I just decided what would look right and started bending the 5mm capillary tubing. The front has a few bends to sneak it down to the lower portion of the bed, and the rear sits up just behind the inner fender wells. I did some testing on my bender to figure out the bend radius. I have used this quite a few times since getting it as a gift a few years back, but I never really felt comfortable with it. I was very accustomed to my hand bender and knew exactly what a bend would look like before I even started. I was able to figure out a good measurement system which made this roll bar bend very smooth. Sometimes it just takes a little time to get the hang of something and feel comfortable. Both ends of the roll bar gets the same scale metal supplies tabs brazed in place. For the front, I tapped the tab to accept an M3 screw that was put in from the bottom. In the rear, which is a little more visible, I used a through hole drilled out for some M2 hardware. It's a little risky, but I needed to braze down the bars in place. I could have made a jig, but since there's no roof and I could angle the flame away, I figured I'd be okay. There was a lot still left before I can get to the paint. I don't focus too much on surface finish as I am building. After getting the surface sanded to 220 grit, I switched to wet sanding. I start with 320 grit and move to 400 grit before paint. If I sand the paint between color and clear, I'll use a 600 grit. The roof and roll bar are painted. I'm using automotive touch-up paint for the roof and wheel paint for the roll bar. There are some small 3D printed parts which need to get added to the body right before painting. One of these are some door hinges. I printed them off with a tab that gets inserted into the body. This allows for a positive hold of glue where only a small portion protrudes. A thin coat of color is sprayed on the body after sanding down to 400 grit. The shine from the thin coat allows me to see any imperfections that are hard to see in primer. Last minute adds are glued into place, such as the 3D printed air intake on the cowl and the hood hinges. I like to leave these off till very last, since it's easier to sand without them in place. All of the interior panels are painted with a base coat red and clear coat. Items are taped up to get other colors applied. All the small details, which are just too hard to tape off, are painted by hand. Most of this is easy enough, but some pieces require me to get my 3x magnifiers to help out with my bifocals. The way I design interior parts, things like buttons, radios, shifters, handles, etc., are all made separately. This allows me to get good detail paint jobs without bleeding over to the larger part. Most parts have a peg which aligns to a hole. This allows for easy alignment and just a dab of glue to hold it in place. Some of the panels are just too hard to add later, so these need to be hand painted on the larger part. Here I'm adding in paint to the cluster and switch panel. Masking tape was added to the truck so flocking could be glued to the floor. A flocking tool helps spread out the material and gives it a charge. This charge helps the pieces stand on end instead of just clumping and laying flat. The end result is a pretty accurate representation of carpet. Some final details like floor mats and light lenses were added before moving on to the patina. I was asked to make it look like paint was good, but had some sun fading. Kind of like it came from Arizona or from another dry desert area. This was accomplished with oil paints. I took red and mixed it with a little bit of white and got almost a pink color, a lot lighter than the red, and put that down on top of the red in areas where I thought the sun would fade it. The idea is that the bright red paint is going to go almost white or pink underneath, so you want to give that representation. So this is a very unique build and was a lot of fun. I have another one of these to finish up, which is a 4-seater. I'm really looking forward to what is coming up. But until then, I'll see you on the rocks.